Most people imagine that being a single mother is loud. They picture constant chaos, arguments, struggle that spills out into the open. My life was not like that. My life was quiet. Every morning began the same way. I woke before the sun, not because I wanted to, but because silence was easier to manage than the rush that came later. My small apartment would still be dark, the streets outside barely moving, and for a few minutes the world felt manageable. Then my son would wake up. His footsteps were always soft at first, like he wasn't sure if he should interrupt the morning yet. I would hear his door creak open, followed by the slow shuffle down the hallway. "Mama," he would say. That word carried everything that mattered in my life. After my divorce 3 years earlier, the world had narrowed in a way I never expected. Friends stopped calling as often. Couples we used to spend time with quietly moved on with their own lives. Invitations became rare. People rarely say it directly, but there is something about being a single mother that makes others uncomfortable. You remind them of something fragile, something that didn't work. So I learned to keep my life small. I worked as a receptionist at a small dental office on the edge of the city. It wasn't exciting work, but it was steady, predictable. I answered calls, scheduled appointments, and kept records organized. Most days passed quietly, and that suited me. I wasn't trying to build a new life anymore. I was trying to maintain the one I had left. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It came from Claire, one of the dental assistants who had worked beside me for nearly 2 years. She was kind in the easy way some people are, not overly close, but never distant either. When she handed me the envelope during lunch, she looked almost nervous. "You don't have to come," she said quickly. "I just wanted you to know you're invited." I smiled and thanked her. But after she walked away, I stared at the envelope for a long time. Weddings had become complicated for me. They carried a strange weight, not jealousy exactly, something quieter than that, a reminder of promises people once believed in. That evening, after my son fell asleep, I opened the invitation at the kitchen table. The ceremony was scheduled for Saturday at a large event hall outside the city, the kind of place with tall glass windows and landscaped gardens. I almost decided not to go. It would have been easy to invent an excuse. Childcare issues, work responsibilities, anything simple. But something stopped me. For months I had been telling myself that my life wasn't over. That being alone didn't mean being invisible. So I arranged for my neighbor to watch my son for the evening. On Saturday, I wore the only formal dress I owned, a dark blue one that had survived several years in the back of my closet. When I arrived at the venue, the parking lot was already full. The building itself looked warm and bright, glowing with soft lights behind tall windows. Inside, guests were gathering in small groups, greeting each other like they belonged there. Families, couples, long histories I knew nothing about. I signed the guest book quietly and stepped into the reception hall. For a moment, I just stood there, not lost, just separate. Eventually, I found my assigned table near the edge of the room and sat down. The chair beside me remained empty. I told myself that was perfectly fine. Some people simply attend weddings alone. I picked up my glass of water and watched the room fill with conversation and laughter. No one noticed me, and honestly, I had expected that. At the time, I didn't know the night would change the way everyone in that room looked at me. Or why. At first, the reception felt exactly the way weddings usually do. Soft music drifted through the room while people moved between tables, greeting relatives and friends they had not seen in years. Waiters carried trays of drinks, and the low sound of conversations blended into a comfortable background noise. I sat quietly at my table and watched. Being alone in a room full of people gives you a strange advantage. You begin noticing things others overlook. The bride and groom were still moving through the crowd, thanking guests and posing for photographs. Claire looked happy in the careful way brides often do, smiling constantly, but also checking small details around the room. I lifted my glass and nodded politely when she passed my table. She smiled back with relief, as if she was glad I had come. For a while, everything felt normal, but then I started noticing small interruptions in the rhythm of the evening. They were subtle, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. The first was the groom's father. He stood near the entrance to the reception hall longer than anyone else. While most people were focused on conversations or drinks, he kept glancing toward the main doors. Not casually, carefully. Every few minutes he would check the hallway outside the room, then return to his spot beside the bar. At first I assumed he was waiting for late guests, but after nearly 20 minutes, the pattern became harder to ignore. The second thing I noticed was the staff. Waiters moved quickly between tables, but there was a tension in the way they spoke to each other. Their voices stayed low, and more than once I saw one of them glance toward the same entrance the groom's father was watching. It felt like the room was expecting someone important. I tried not to read too much into it. Weddings bring all kinds of complicated family dynamics. Wealthy relatives, business partners, people who arrive late and expect attention. Still, something about the atmosphere felt slightly off. At the table behind me, two women were speaking in hushed voices. I wasn't trying to listen, but certain words drifted through the air anyway. Did you hear if he's actually coming? I don't know, but if he does, they'll have to change the seating. Why would they invite him in the first place? The second woman gave a quiet laugh. Because some invitations aren't really invitations. Their voices faded as someone else joined their conversation. I told myself it probably had nothing to do with me, and most likely it didn't. Still, I noticed more small things as the evening continued. A few guests arrived late and were greeted with relief by the groom's father. Others were guided quickly to their seats by staff members who seemed unusually attentive. Once, a man in a dark suit walked through the hall, scanning the tables as if he were looking for someone. He didn't stay long, but the room became noticeably quieter while he passed. I focused on my plate and tried not to think about it. After years of raising my son alone, I had learned that not every strange moment needed to become a concern. Sometimes the best decision was simply to stay quiet and let events pass. So I stayed at my table, watching the evening unfold. The empty chair beside me remained untouched. People walked past my table without noticing it, without noticing me. And for most of the night, that invisibility felt familiar, comfortable even. Until the moment the chair beside me suddenly moved, and someone sat down. The change in the room was so immediate that I felt it before I even turned my head. Conversations slowed. Glasses stopped halfway to people's lips. Across the room, the groom's father froze. Only then did I realize that whoever had just taken the seat beside me was the person everyone had been waiting for. For a few seconds, I didn't turn toward him. I simply sat there, aware of the sudden stillness around our table. When a room full of people changes its behavior all at once, you feel it before you understand it. Conversations softened. Laughter faded. Even the music seemed quieter, though I knew it probably was. I slowly placed my glass back on the table. Then I turned my head. The man sitting beside me looked calm, almost ordinary at first glance. He was wearing a dark suit, perfectly tailored but not flashy. His posture was relaxed, his hands resting lightly on the table as if he had every right to be there. But the way people were reacting to him made the air feel heavier. He glanced around the room once, not in a suspicious way, but with the quiet awareness of someone used to being watched. Then his attention shifted to me. His expression didn't change. "Good evening," he said. His voice was low and controlled. I nodded politely, unsure what else to do. "Good evening." Up close, I could see that he was older than I first thought, maybe early 40s. His face carried the kind of calm confidence that comes from years of being taken seriously, or feared. I wasn't sure which. For a moment, neither of us spoke again. Across the room, I noticed the groom's father watching our table carefully. A few other guests were doing the same, though they tried to hide it. The man beside me leaned slightly closer, not close enough to invade my space, just enough that only I could hear him. "May I ask you something unusual?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, then nodded. "I suppose so." His eyes studied my face for a brief moment as if confirming something in his mind. Then he said quietly, "Pretend you're my wife and dance with me." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. I blinked. "I'm sorry." His expression remained calm. "There's a dance starting in a moment," he explained softly. "It would help me if you stood up with me when the music begins." The words were polite, but they weren't really a request, more like a carefully worded instruction. My first instinct was to refuse. I didn't know this man. I didn't understand what was happening in the room around us. Every instinct I had developed over years of cautious living told me that getting involved in someone else's situation rarely ended well. "I think you might have the wrong person," I said quietly. He shook his head once. "No," he replied. "I chose the right one." His tone wasn't threatening. If anything, it was almost respectful. But the tension in the room was becoming impossible to ignore. Guests nearby were pretending to focus on their meals while clearly listening to our conversation. At the bar, the groom's father was speaking quickly to another man in a suit. Something about the situation felt larger than I understood. I glanced toward the empty chair across from me, suddenly wishing someone I knew was sitting there. The man beside me followed my gaze. "You won't need to say anything," he said. "Just stand with me when the music starts." Right on cue, the band shifted into a slow song. Couples around the room began standing up from their tables. My chest tightened. If I refused now, the attention would fall directly on us. And based on the way everyone was already watching, I had a feeling that attention might not be something I wanted. The man slowly stood beside me. Then he extended his hand. He didn't smile. He simply waited. The entire room felt like it was holding its breath. For reasons I still can't fully explain, I placed my hand in his and stood up. Across the reception hall, someone quietly muttered a name I had never heard before, but judging by the way people reacted to it, it was a name everyone else in that room already knew. His hand was steady when he guided me toward the dance floor. Not tight, not controlling, just firm enough that I understood he expected me to follow. The band was already playing, and several couples had stepped onto the floor ahead of us. Their movements were slow and comfortable, the way people dance when they know each other well. But as we approached, I noticed something strange. A few couples moved slightly aside, not dramatically, just enough to give us space. The man placed one hand lightly at the center of my back and began to move with the music. His steps were slow, practiced, as if he had done this countless times before. I followed carefully. It had been years since I had danced with anyone like this. Up close, I could feel the quiet attention of the room pressing in from all directions. People were watching, trying not to stare, but watching. "You're doing fine," he said quietly. "I'm not sure I agreed to this," I replied. His eyes met mine for a brief moment. "I know." There was no apology in his voice, but there wasn't arrogance either, just a calm acknowledgement of the situation. For a minute, neither of us spoke. The music carried us slowly across the floor while conversations around the room stayed unusually quiet. Finally, I said the question that had been sitting in my mind since he sat down. "Why me?" He studied my face again, the same careful way he had earlier. "You were sitting alone," he said. "That can't be the only reason." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he guided me through a small turn, then returned us to the slow rhythm of the dance. "Sometimes," he said after a moment, "the safest person in a room is the one nobody is paying attention to." His words settled uncomfortably in my chest. Before I could respond, the song began to end. Applause spread lightly through the hall as the band transitioned to another melody. Couples began returning to their tables. The man released my hand without hesitation. "Thank you," he said. Then he walked away. Just like that. No explanation, no introduction. He crossed the room calmly while several guests stepped aside to let him pass. I stood on the dance floor for a moment, unsure what to do with the strange silence that followed him. Eventually, I returned to my table. The empty chair beside me was still there, but now people were looking at me differently. Not warmly, not coldly, just carefully. A woman from the neighboring table leaned slightly toward me. "You danced with him," she said. Her voice carried a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Yes," I replied quietly. She stared at me for a moment longer. "You didn't know who he was, did you?" "No," she shook her head slowly. "Well, that explains it." Before I could ask what she meant, another guest at the table interrupted. "Oh, please," he said dismissively. "There's nothing mysterious about it." The woman frowned at him. "You say that now," he shrugged. "People exaggerate stories about men like him. He's just a businessman. A businessman who makes everyone in this room nervous." She replied. The man waved his hand as if brushing away the topic. "You're overthinking it. He probably just needed a dance partner." Several other guests nearby seemed eager to move the conversation in the same direction. "Exactly," one of them added. "You're lucky he asked you." Lucky. The word felt strange. I looked around the room again. Guests who had ignored me earlier were now glancing toward my table more often. Staff members moved quickly when they passed nearby. The atmosphere had shifted in a way I couldn't explain. But every time I tried to ask someone directly about the man, the answers became vague, dismissive, or suddenly quiet. It was as if everyone knew something, and none of them wanted to be the person who said it out loud. The evening stretched on, and I tried to focus on small details, the flicker of candlelight across the tablecloth, the soft clink of silverware, the way the band transitioned between songs. But I couldn't stop noticing him. The man, the one who had asked me to dance, I didn't know his name. I didn't even know why he had chosen me. But everywhere I looked, people reacted as if they did. It began in fragments, a whisper here, a glance there. A guest at a neighboring table leaning toward their companion, voice low enough that I couldn't catch every word. He's always like this, knows everyone, careful with who he trusts. The invitation, absolutely necessary, could cause problems otherwise. You can't just ignore him. I tried not to listen, but the pieces of the conversation fell like stones in my mind. Something was being said about him, something significant. The words painted a picture I couldn't fully understand. Later, while waiting for dessert, I overheard the band coordinator speaking to the manager. I caught snippets. Needs her there, nothing can happen if she's under his protection. That was the only option, safest choice. I blinked. Her protection, safe. Suddenly, the polite dance seemed like a calculated act. Not a whim, not coincidence, something much larger. I looked around. Staff were still attentive, but now their attentiveness had a sharpness to it, anticipation, caution. The same careful energy radiated from the guests. Conversation stopped briefly when I passed, resumes only when I moved away. I realized slowly that my invisibility in this room had turned into something else. I had become a placeholder, a shield, a carefully chosen figure in a delicate social web I didn't yet understand. The man appeared at the dessert table unannounced. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he watched me from a distance, calm, composed, silent. Even standing there, he seemed to shift the room's focus, and people who had barely noticed me before now stepped aside or bowed their heads slightly. Finally, he came closer, offering a polite nod. No words, just presence. I tried to meet someone else's eyes to ask them what was happening, but no one would look at me. Or if they did, they quickly turned away. And in that moment, I understood a quiet, uncomfortable truth. The man's choice had created a ripple through the room. It was more than a dance. It was a statement. And everyone in the room knew exactly what it meant. I didn't yet, but I could feel its weight pressing against me. That evening, between the music and the murmurs, I began piecing it together. Whatever he was, whatever the room knew about him, I had been chosen. Carefully, intentionally. And that choice, I realized, was only the beginning. After dessert, the reception slowed into a quieter rhythm. Couples leaned in close, whispering to one another. Children ran lightly across the edges of the room. Glasses clinked softly. Yet the moment I sat down, the subtle tension from before returned, sharper this time, heavier, almost tangible. He appeared again, without announcement, and took a seat across from me for a moment. Not to speak, not to touch, just presence. And the room shifted. Waiters moved with a little more haste when passing our table. Guests who had ignored me earlier now nodded politely, even deferentially, as if acknowledging a status I didn't feel I had earned. People who had whispered or turned away earlier now gave cautious smiles, avoiding eye contact, their gestures calculated. I felt it immediately, the strange, uncomfortable power. It wasn't that he was loud or commanding, it was quieter than that. The room simply obeyed him, without words, without threat. And I, sitting beside him, was part of it. Whether I liked it or not, I had become visible. I tried to catch his attention. "Why are you doing this?" I asked softly. His eyes met mine, calm and unflinching. "Because you were the safest choice," he said. His voice carried no apology, no charm, only clarity. No one else in this room would have handled it quietly, not with their own pride, not with their own expectations. I swallowed, unsure what to say. It didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like recognition of my invisibility. The very thing I had always tried to navigate quietly now marked me for attention. Later, I noticed small, almost imperceptible changes in how guests treated me. One of the servers refilled my glass before I even asked. Another offered me a delicate plate of dessert with a nod. A guest who had walked past me without a glance now stopped to comment on my dress politely, their voice measured, cautious. I understood then that being chosen meant more than a dance. It meant that my presence was being noticed, calculated, and protected. The man's quiet influence shifted the room around me without a single announcement. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I felt it everywhere. At one point, someone whispered a warning carefully so I might hear it. "Don't misunderstand this. He doesn't do this for everyone." I kept my face neutral, but inside my chest tightened. The same room that had ignored me hours ago now treated me differently, carefully. I wondered how many of them knew more than they were letting on. And I realized that I had no idea what role I was truly playing, only that it carried weight I wasn't sure I wanted. The band shifted into a slower song, one that naturally drew couples back to the floor. He extended his hand once more. I hesitated. He didn't push. He simply waited. I felt all eyes on us again. When I took his hand, it wasn't the polite dance of before. The moment felt heavier. The movement across the floor was slow, deliberate, almost ritualized. Every step carried significance I couldn't name. People moved aside quietly, giving space. Conversations fell silent. Even the musicians seemed to notice, their instruments softer, more careful. I realized then that this was not a game. This was not a casual evening social interaction. This was power. Quiet, careful, unspoken power. And I was now entangled in it, whether I wanted to be or not. By the time the song ended, I understood one simple, undeniable truth. I had entered a world I did not understand, and it had noticed me. After the second dance, I returned to my table, my hands still trembling slightly from the unfamiliar attention. The room had shifted entirely. Guests who had barely acknowledged me earlier now spoke in careful, polite tones. Staff moved with near-deferential efficiency when they passed my table. The energy of the room felt orchestrated, precise, like I had been swept into a subtle current I couldn't control. I sank into my chair, suddenly aware of how heavy the evening had become. It wasn't just the music or the whispers or the carefully measured glances. It was the realization that everything I had always known about myself, my invisibility, my quiet existence, my ability to stay unnoticed, had been exactly why I had been chosen. For a long time, I had considered invisibility a shield, a way to navigate the world without risk, without scrutiny. But now, that shield had placed me directly in the spotlight of someone else's power. I was no longer just a single mother quietly living her life. I was the figure everyone else had agreed could safely stand beside him. I was essential in a way I hadn't asked for, and the weight of that truth pressed against my chest. I remembered my son, asleep at home, his small presence the only anchor in a life that often felt unsteady. I thought about all the times I had made myself small to protect him, to keep him safe. And now I realized that the world could make me small too, only to use me for reasons beyond my understanding. I excused myself and stepped into the quiet hallway near the entrance. The sounds of the reception, laughter, music, polite conversation were muffled here. I leaned against the wall, taking deep, uneven breaths. My mind spun with questions. Why me? Why tonight? And why did no one seem willing to answer? I watched as guests continued to drift past, their eyes occasionally darting toward the dance floor, toward him, and finally toward me. The realization struck me fully. The night wasn't about me, but it was about what I represented. My life, my struggle, my quiet resilience, all of it had been seen, measured, and used. I felt a cold clarity settle in my chest. This wasn't a story of chance. This was calculated. And in that calculated moment, I also recognized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before, the painful truth of my own vulnerability. For the first time that evening, I understood how fragile the invisible could be when noticed by the powerful. I returned to my seat, holding my head high, but inside I was quietly unraveling. The dance, the attention, the careful whispers, they were not about kindness, and they were not about chance. They were about control, about observation, about power that had nothing to do with me, and yet everything to do with me. By the time the dessert plates were cleared, I had accepted the uncomfortable truth. My invisibility had ended. And with it, a part of my innocence, my quiet confidence had quietly broken. I was awake now. I was seen. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to remain in that light. The remainder of the evening unfolded in a strange, careful rhythm. Every movement, every conversation, seemed tempered by the presence of the man. I could feel the eyes of the room following me, measuring, judging, calculating. And yet something had shifted. People who had barely noticed me hours ago now moved with consideration, nodding politely, offering seats, holding doors, or speaking in tones that suggested respect, or perhaps caution. I understood what had happened. The quiet influence he wielded had transformed the way the room regarded me. The invisible had become visible. I had stepped into a space I hadn't chosen, and yet the room treated me as if I belonged there, not because of who I was, but because of the association he had created by simply standing beside me. I watched the man from across the room. He wasn't speaking loudly. He didn't call attention to himself, yet the energy in the room had shifted entirely around him, and indirectly around me. People who had dismissed me earlier now avoided my table with exaggerated care. Waiters preemptively offered assistance. Even guests I barely knew nodded politely in passing. Finally, he approached me, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, it seemed he might explain everything, but instead he spoke softly, almost casually. "You understand now. You were never my wife, just the right choice for tonight." His words were simple. no apology, no explanation, but their weight was immense. Around us, the room responded almost imperceptibly. Conversations restarted with slightly less ease. Guests who had previously avoided or whispered about me shifted, returning to their prior social rhythm, but with a subtle new awareness. The unspoken truth had been made visible, and the consequences rippled quietly through the room. I realized that my role, brief as it had been, had created a small, undeniable change. Some people looked at me differently. Some reconsidered their assumptions. Some quietly acknowledged the power they had overlooked in those they deemed insignificant. It was not revenge. It was not spectacle. It was quiet, unremarkable justice delivered through perception alone. And as I stood from the table to leave the reception hall, I understood the weight of truth. The room had seen me, not as a single mother quietly surviving life, but as someone connected, momentarily, fleetingly, to a force it could not ignore. And that recognition, subtle as it was, left its mark on everyone, including me. The night had ended, but the consequences of what had passed were quietly irreversible. I walked out of the reception hall alone. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of gardens and distant streetlights. The hum of music and laughter behind me felt like it belonged to another world, one I had only briefly visited. I didn't look back. The room, the whispers, the careful glances, they no longer concerned me. I had learned what I needed to know. Visibility, respect, and influence could be borrowed, wielded quietly, and then vanish just as silently. The night had shown me the fragility of perception, the subtle shifts that power can create without spectacle or fanfare. When I returned home, my son was asleep, curled in his small bed. I watched him for a moment, feeling the weight of the evening press against my chest, but also a strange clarity. Nothing had changed in the world outside my apartment. No one had called, no letters had arrived, no one had delivered announcements of admiration or celebration. The man, the dance, the room full of observers, all were gone. And yet the truth remained. I realized dignity is not borrowed from the powerful. It is quiet, earned in moments unseen, in the choices we make when no one is watching. I had been noticed tonight, but I would not rely on that attention. It had shown me something I could never unsee about people, about power, about the world. And in the stillness of my apartment, I felt the subtle strength of simply existing, knowing my worth even when no one else did. The evening had ended quietly as it began. No applause, no confrontation, just a slow, heavy recognition of truth. I sat beside my sleeping son, letting the silence stretch around us. And for the first time in hours, I felt something I hadn't in a long while. Calm.